Welcome back everyone to another reaction video, and we are most definitely going to continue our look at Kings and Generals, Caesar and Gaul. In fact, Kings and Generals is now subscribed to this channel, so that's awesome. Thank you. Fantastic content, Kings and Generals. Keep it up, and we're going to push as many of our viewers in your direction as we possibly can, because you deserve every subscriber and every view that you can possibly get. So thank you for that. But in the middle of doing that series, I wanted to take some time to revisit Oversimplified. So we're going to take a look at one of their mini war videos today, which is only about 7 minutes long. And this is the one about the Falklands. This is the only one of the Oversimplified videos, I think, that's about an event that I actually remember. I was 5 years old when these events took place, at least the ones about the war itself. I vaguely remember a little bit about the Falklands when they happened. But by and large, you know, this wasn't something the United States was too involved in. So I don't remember a whole lot being on TV about it. And I don't know a whole lot about it. I know a little bit about these events, but I mostly just want to react and kind of see what they have to say about it. I think it'll be a lot of fun. As always, make sure you check out the original content creator. We want to give them credit for it. They will be getting the ad revenue from this video anyway, but it's still important to support them as much as we can. This just gives us an opportunity to talk about history, and I'm always looking for those opportunities. So let's dive into the Falklands.
Hi, English Mariner John Strong. Hi, Anthony Carey, 5th Viscount of Falkland. I would very much like for you to go to Chile and locate the wreck of a Spanish treasure ship for me. Okay. Hey, I found some islands. The English were probably not the first to discover the Falklands, but they were the first to write it down. They found it to be cold, wet, and miserable, just like home. So
I was just thinking that. As soon as they said cold, wet, and miserable, isn't that how people describe the UK? So they're like, yeah, just like home. Here in Northeast Ohio, it's cold, wet, and miserable too, but we add snow to the mix most of the time. But we are one of the least sunny places in America, so everybody's cold, wet, and miserable here too.
They established a colony in 1765, unaware that the French had also discovered the islands and done the same a year earlier. And for a while the two were unaware of each other's existence, until presumably there was an awkward moment where they ran into each other.
And this is, I mean, 1765, we're talking right in the middle of the time where you're about to have the 7 Years' War, or you've already had the 7 Years' War. So these nations are already at war. In large part over colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So interesting to see how that connects to what's happening in North America.
Then the Spanish showed up and told the French that a couple hundred years earlier the Pope drew a line on a map and said all of this belongs to Portugal and all of this belongs to Spain.
So the line of demarcation, if you're not familiar with that, was drawn by the Pope, and that's why Brazil was primarily Portuguese, and pretty much everything else in South America ends up speaking Spanish. Because of that line of demarcation, Brazil was the part that was east of that line and given to Portugal, and everything else was west and therefore given to Spain.
And that the island was in Spain's territory and they would like the French to hand over their settlement. Now, since the two were good friends and Spain was willing to pay in cash money, the French obliged. But since they were still a little bitter about the recent 7 Years' War thing, they made sure to warn the Spanish not to let those dirty English on the other side of the island take over. So Spain went over to the English and explained, Pope, line on map, Spain's island. And the English said, yeah, right, this is our island. But the Spanish had more guns, so they kicked them off anyway. But then England threatened to go to war. So Spain went to their friends in France and said, hey, it looks like stuff is about to go down. You in on this? And the French Minister of War said, yeah, and we'll launch a full-scale invasion of England and party like it's 1066. But then King Louis XV said, 1, you're insane, and 2, you're fired. Sorry, Spain, we're not ready for a war right now.
1, you're insane. 2, you're fired. Partly like it's 1066. That was the year of the Battle of Hastings, the Norman invasion of England. But man, this is such a consequential time in history. This is when the American Revolution's about to happen. This is very soon before the French Revolution, which would be Louis XVI, the next king.
Yeah. So Spain had to give the English their settlement back, saying it's still our island. And the English said, no, it's our island. Then some colonists in North America got a bit rowdy, so the English had to leave their settlement to go focus on that. But they left behind a plaque that said this is totally still our island. So the island was in Spanish hands. But then a French guy, no, not that one, turned on the Spanish, took over most of the country, and captured King Ferdinand VII. And in response, the Spanish colonies in South America started vying for independence.
And if you are not familiar with all of that, I did a series looking at the story of Simon Bolivar, who is responsible for a lot of that. So again, very consequential time in history. You've got the American Revolution. You've got what's happening with the Falklands. You've got the independence movements breaking out in Northwest South America. This is really a time when a lot of things are going down.
So Spain had a little bit on its hands and also had to leave the islands. And for a couple decades, the islands were left uninhabited except for the penguins, some fishermen, and the gauchos, which are basically like cowboys but cooler and Spanisher. A merchant from Hamburg living in the now independent United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata heard about the feral cattle roaming the Falklands and thought it would be a good way to make some money. So he got permission from both Buenos Aires and the British government to set up trade there as a private venture. Some American ships came down and began hunting whales and seals around the islands, and Verney wasn't too happy about it. So he asked...
So whale hunting's a big deal at this time because this is before they've started drilling for oil in the ground. You know, that doesn't really happen until the later part of the 1800s in large part. And so the primary source for oil lamps, for example, is going to come from whale oil. So whale hunting's a big part of the economy around the world at this time.
Buenos Aires for some military assistance in defending the islands, but Buenos Aires said, meh, do it yourself, gave him some weapons, and appointed him governor of the islands. So he seized the US ships and arrested their crews. In response, two things happened. First, America came down and said, nice settlement you have there. Would be a shame if someone destroyed it. And then they destroyed it.
So the United States, under James Monroe, who's one of the earliest presidents of the United States, he has what's come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically Europe stay out of the Western Hemisphere, stay out of the Americas, basically. And so the United States foreign policy was, we'll worry about what happens in North South America. Europe, you worry about what happens in Europe. You have your place, we have ours. And so the U.S. starts to get really involved in things like what's happening here.
Second, Britain heard Verney had been appointed governor, meaning the United Provinces, actually now the Argentine Confederation, were officially claiming the islands as theirs. So Britain showed up and said, hey, didn't you see our plaque? And since they had more guns, they kicked them off the island. And the Falklands remained firmly in British hands for the next century. They officially became a crown colony in 1840. Port Stanley became the island's capital in 1845. The cattle hides from the island weren't worth much, so they imported sheep from Britain in 1851. 2 world wars came and went, and all this time the Argentinians never rescinded their claim over the islands. Now it's 1976, and after a couple civil wars, a new brutal military dictatorship sponsored by the US fight against communism has taken control in Argentina.
I like how he glosses over. Sponsored by the US fight against communism. You know, often people that were pretty unsavory characters would get supported by the US government as long as they opposed the communists. And if you had a country where communism is a threat to take over, especially in the Americas, the U.S. will support pretty much anybody who opposes that, even if they're a horrible dictator themselves.
And by 1981, this guy was in power. The economy had been struggling for a long time, and Galtieri had been unable to improve the situation. Now, if you ever find yourself the brutal military leader of a struggling South American country and you start getting into hot water, here's a bit of advice that has been tried and tested throughout the centuries. Start a war to distract everyone from their misery.
Exactly. Anytime, and it's not just fascist dictators who do this, everybody does this. You find something, number one, that'll distract the people from what's going on at home, but also something that will unite the people against a foreign enemy. And you can look at examples all throughout history of people doing just that. It's a tried and true thing to do. I just wouldn't recommend doing it against a major power in the world. Maybe pick on somebody a little smaller. Probably not the UK.
Galtieri knew how popular he would be if he could finally take back Argentina's last Malvinas from the occupying British. There had been proposals to cut British military spending, and the ice patrol vessel HMS Endurance had been withdrawn from the area. So the Argentinians assumed the British may not even bother doing anything about the invasion. After easily capturing the largely uninhabited South Georgia island, 600 Argentine troops were sent to the Falklands. The small number of Royal Marines and other British forces stationed there put up a small amount of resistance, but in the end had to surrender to the larger Argentine force.
Now, depending on who's in charge in the UK, you might be able to get away with this, and you might even get the UK to say, okay, you know what, fine. The problem was that they decided to do this when the Iron Lady was in charge, Margaret Thatcher. And Margaret Thatcher, and I don't know if it's because she was a woman and she really felt like she had to prove herself, or this is just who she was. but Margaret Thatcher was the wrong person to mess with in any situation, especially when it came to combat.
Crowds in Argentina celebrated the news, but they were wrong to assume the British would do nothing, because the person in charge of the United Kingdom at the time was this lady. Thatcher was a somewhat controversial prime minister, but whether you loved her or hated her, there was no denying that she was tough. Like metal. Iron, for example. She immediately declared an exclusion zone around the islands and organized for a task force of over 100 ships to set sail for the Falklands. The United Nations expressed concern at the Argentine invasion. All South American nations apart from Chile backed Argentina, and since the United States had propped up the Argentine dictatorship, Reagan went to Thatcher and said, "Could you maybe just let them have the islands?" And Thatcher said no. Okay, here, have some weapons. Fighting a war over 8,000 miles from home was a
Okay, here, have some weapons. And that was something Reagan did in more than one occasion. Iran-Contra is another example of that. The Contra rebels were, again, this is one of those situations down in Central America, I think it's Nicaragua, where you're supporting freedom fighters as long as they're opposing your natural enemies in communism.
Logistical challenge for the British. They requisitioned civilian cruise ships and containers, and they used British-owned Ascension Island as a forward base. By the time they arrived at the Falklands in May, the Argentine forces had had time to entrench themselves. The first task for the British was to gain control of the seas, which they did easily. On the 2nd of May, a British submarine sank an Argentine cruiser. The sinking was controversial, as it occurred outside the British exclusion zone. It was also the largest loss of life in a single incident during the war.
And I want to say they used Exocet missiles to do this. So this is one of the earliest examples you have of a submarine using a missile to sink a major surface vessel. I'm pretty sure. In fact, I think we're going to look that up. Let's take a look real quick. I was wrong. It was actually the opposite. It was the Argentinians who were using Exocet missiles. Those are French missiles. They used them on the HMS Sheffield. So, yeah, I was a little off on that. So good thing we looked it up. Let's continue.
And in response, the Argentine Navy withdrew from the islands. The next task for the British was to gain air superiority. While the Argentine Air Force controlled the skies, they were able to inflict considerable damage on the Royal Navy below. Days after the sinking of the General Belgrano, 2 Argentine super-étendards carried out a raid on the HMS Sheffield and sank it with an Exocet missile. For weeks, the Argentine Air Force would continue to carry out raids and inflict heavy casualties on the Royal Navy, with British Sea Harriers doing their best to take out as many of the Argentine aircraft as they could. While the battle in the skies raged on, San Carlos was chosen as the best landing site for the British ground forces. An SAS raid took out Argentine defenses on Pebble Island, and the HMS Alacrity sailed through Falklands Sound to flush out any Argentine supply ships. The landings began on May 21st, with Argentine aircraft carrying out full-scale raids on the task force ships taking part in the landing, damaging several and sinking a few, but anti-aircraft cannons and Sea Harriers shot down many of the aircraft in what became a major turning point for air superiority. And
so this is really largely a air and naval war that's happening here. Not a lot of ground troops being used.
a beachhead was successfully formed. Then the ground troops began their movements out of San Carlos, across the north towards Stanley, and south toward the Argentine stronghold at Goose Green. In the following battles, a clear trend emerged. The Argentine conscripts put up a good fight, and with the rough, muddy terrain, the war was by no means easy for the British. But with highly skilled Royal Marine commanders and parachute regiment troops, the British would often find themselves taking on larger numbers of Argentinian soldiers, but would still come out victorious with minimal casualties. The 14-hour-long battle for Goose Green commenced on the night of May 28th. The battle ended in a decisive British victory, with over 900 Argentinians surrendering. Then, with 5,000 reinforcements arriving from the 5th Infantry Brigade, the British started preparing for their final assault on Stanley. In a series of hard-fought battles, they took control of the hills and mountains surrounding the town, as the Argentine forces withdrew, with British ships shelling their positions from offshore. Utterly surrounded, on the 14th of June, the Argentinians surrendered, and the war was over.
So, yeah, this was a pretty smart strategy by the British. You establish naval and air superiority first. You do that and you make sure that battle's won before you start putting the ground troops in. And then you use highly skilled, highly trained ground troops against what are essentially conscripts who don't have air superiority, who don't have naval support. And it's going to be a pretty easy win for you. So I want to take a look real quick at what the casualties are like in this war. And I don't know, he may actually cover this, but let's take a look at it. You have 255 killed for the UK, 775 wounded, 649 killed, and 1,600 wounded on the Argentine side. So pretty low casualty counts. I mean, you know, that's, what, a half hour at the Battle of Gettysburg? I mean, but it wasn't low, obviously, for those families. For every one of those 255 or 649 killed. That's a family. That's a family who's never the same. And so for them, the Falklands War is the worst thing that ever happened or would happen. So we can't look at those numbers and say, no big deal, wasn't that bad. It was that bad to every one of those families.
The 2-month-long war claimed hundreds of lives and left the islands strewn with minefields that still pose a problem to this day. Argentina still claims the islands, but in 2013 a referendum was held, and the islanders voted 99.8% in favor of remaining British.
Well then.
Plus, oil was just found near the islands, so the British probably aren't going to give them up anytime soon.
So that was cool, and a couple of times there I looked stuff up right before it was mentioned in the video, but that's the first time I've ever seen that one. So let's continue the conversation. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Let's talk a little more about the Falklands, talk about what happened at any point in that history of what they just covered there. A lot of fun. We'll get to some of the other mini wars here in the near future, and I've put a link in the description to all of my other reactions to Oversimplified videos if you want to check those out. Some of them are longer, some of them are shorter. Some of them are older videos, some of them are newer. Thanks for watching.